What happens to a society when truth stops mattering? When lying becomes routine, surveillance turns into a virtue, and thinking for yourself is dangerous. George Orwell saw this up close. He faced empires, wars, and revolutions. And in the middle of all that chaos, he realized something that many people still ignore today. The biggest enemy of freedom isn't violence, it's the lie dressed up as truth. In this video, we're going to walk step by step through Orwell's journey, not just as a writer, but as a thinker of power and freedom. We're going to see how his life led him to write Animal Farm and 1984, and how he predicted a world where words are weapons, the past is rewritten, and freedom is quietly suffocated. If you think all of this is just fiction, think again. Because what Orwell wrote wasn't a warning about the future, it was a mirror held up to the present. George Orwell was born in 1903 in British India, one of the pillars of the vast British Empire, a system that, at the time, controlled about a quarter of the planet. But what does it mean to be born inside an empire? For Orwell, it meant being born between two worlds, the world of privilege and the world of domination. And it was exactly this ambiguous position, this living border between colonizer and colonized, that planted the first seeds of the criticism that would shape all of his work. His birth name was Eric Arthur Blair, and although his family had some social prestige, they lived in a condition he later described as lower middle class with upper class pretensions. That contradiction deeply shaped how he saw the world. Orwell was a man stuck between status and scarcity, between imperial pride and moral discomfort. As a child, Orwell was sent to England to study. The early separation from his parents and life in strict boarding schools left deep marks on his youth. He studied at elite institutions like St. Cyprian's and later Eton, cradle of the British aristocracy. There, he lived off scholarships and school charity, constantly reminded of his lower social position even inside the elite. He was treated like someone who should be grateful just to be there, a tolerated guest at a prestige masquerade. This feeling of quiet exclusion, of social and intellectual displacement, led Orwell to develop a sharp, critical eye toward the structure of society. He didn't fully belong on the inside, but he also wasn't completely on the outside. And it's exactly this marginal position that, throughout the history of philosophy, has allowed great thinkers to see clearly what everyone else takes for granted. We can compare Orwell to philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who saw the outsider as the one capable of noticing how artificial social norms really are. He also reminds us of the Socratic idea of mimesis. When someone refuses to settle for common opinion, they begin to give birth to their own ideas, to think in an authentic way. In Orwell's case, this mimesis shows up as an early distrust of authority. He didn't just see injustice, he felt it in his own life. His childhood, lived among castes and classes, taught him a lesson that would later take on a philosophical form. Power, even when quiet, still oppresses, and often it does so without us noticing. It's important to remember that this was the height of British imperialism, with India, parts of Africa, and many other regions under direct or indirect control of the crown. Colonial propaganda justified this domination with the idea of supposed civilizational superiority. The white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling called it. For many English people, the empire was a source of pride, but for Orwell, the empire was already starting to smell like hypocrisy and violence. His childhood, marked by this game between material privilege and symbolic exclusion, produced a rare kind of sensitivity. The sensitivity of someone who realizes that power, even when it looks generous, is almost always built on exploitation. It's no coincidence that Orwell would later write that it would be impossible for an Englishman to be decent within an empire. Here we find the first big philosophical lesson in Orwell's thought. Awareness of power is born from discomfort with one's own privileges. Orwell didn't reject the empire because he was its direct victim, but because he understood that his own advantages were built on the suffering of others. This insight is deeply ethical and connects with Emmanuel Levinas's idea of otherness, the idea that responsibility for the other begins when we realize that our existence is not neutral. that we occupy spaces that affect the lives of other people. Even as a young man, Orwell began to see that any system that ranks human beings by race, class, or culture distorts the way we think about right and wrong. This early criticism of the British Empire wasn't just political, it was existential. The empire wasn't only an external system of domination, it was an internal mold. It shaped consciousness, produced identities, created rigid social roles. And from very early on, Orwell saw himself trying to escape that straitjacket. During these years, he also began to write, still timidly, but already showing a tendency to observe the world around him with an eye that cut through the surface. And that's essential. Orwell didn't start out as a fully formed critic, but as an uncomfortable observer. And it's from discomfort, something very human and very philosophical, that he builds his way of thinking. If we look at his life through a philosophical lens, we see that Orwell embodies the ideal of the thinker shaped by lived experience. Not someone who only reads theories, but someone who goes through the friction of the real world. That brings him close to authors like Hannah Arendt, who also saw evil and power not as abstractions, but as phenomena embodied in institutions, routines, and small everyday decisions. It's interesting that Orwell wasn't, at this point, positioning himself as an activist or ideologue. On the contrary, he was developing a deep skepticism toward easy certainties. Maybe that's why his criticism hit so hard. He didn't attack the empire with slogans, but with sharp observations, with irony, with uncomfortable truths. His denunciation of power would be born not from hatred of the other, but from the courage to look at himself, at his own privileges, his own silences. In a certain sense, he lived what Michel Foucault would later describe as the experience of the subject being formed by power. For Foucault, we are not only oppressed by power, we are shaped by it. And Orwell, from childhood, already sensed this. The empire wasn't just something out there, it was something inside, a logic that organized who was superior, who deserved to speak, who had to obey. This point is crucial to understanding the birth of Orwell's critique. It isn't only political, it's ontological. Orwell distrusts whatever presents itself as natural, questions inherited hierarchies, and refuses the shallow peace that hides structural violence. He becomes a thinker of tension, between classes, between cultures, between words and reality. And so, even before fighting in wars or writing dystopias, Orwell was already, in practice, a philosopher. A philosopher without a robe, without a podium, but with a sharp moral compass. His thinking is born from the friction between guilt and clarity, between comfort and discomfort. And that's what makes him so relevant today. Many thinkers are formed inside universities. Orwell was formed inside the contradictions of the world. And maybe that's why he saw power so clearly, because he lived inside it, but never got comfortable with it. His childhood, divided between privilege and exclusion, was the fertile ground for a conscience that would never accept empire as something inevitable. That was the first lesson Orwell left us. Power needs to be looked straight in the eye, even when we are the ones benefiting from it, especially when we are the ones benefiting from it. In 1922, at just 19 years old, George Orwell, still Eric Arthur Blair, made a decision that would deeply change his life and his way of thinking. He joined the Indian Imperial Police and was sent to serve in the British colony of Burma, today's Myanmar. At first, it seemed like a practical choice. For someone from a lower middle-class background who had studied at Eton but didn't have the money to go to university, colonial service offered stability, a salary, and social status. But that apparent stability was hiding what would become a moral abyss. Serving as an agent of the empire was much more than enforcing laws. It meant becoming the visible arm of an invisibly violent system. Orwell quickly realized that colonial authority didn't rest on consent, but on domination, fear, and alienation, including for the people who held power. During his 5 years in Burma, Orwell saw himself as just one gear in a machine he secretly despised. He would later write, "In an empire, it is the dominator who becomes the slave of his own position." That contradiction is at the heart of the essay, A Shooting an Elephant. one of the most devastating reflections on power ever written. In this autobiographical text, Orwell tells the story of a moment when, as a policeman, he is forced to kill an elephant that had caused destruction in a village. The scene is full of tension. The animal, now calm, no longer poses any real threat, but a crowd of Burmese villagers gathers to watch what will happen, and Orwell, or rather the narrator, feels he cannot back down. He kills the elephant not because it's necessary, but because it's expected. The lawman gives in to the pressure of the crowd's gaze. The man of the empire kills to maintain the illusion of control. This is a powerful and deeply philosophical metaphor for the alienation of power. Inspired by ideas from Hegel and Marx, the concept of alienation reminds us that power, when used in a purely instrumental way, turns back against the one who wields it. By obeying the colonial logic, Orwell dehumanizes himself. The elephant's death becomes a symbolic sacrifice of that humanity, proof of how authority forces the dominator to play a role that corrupts him from the inside. Deep down, what A Shooting an Elephant shows is that the empire doesn't only oppress the colonized, it also oppresses the colonizer. Orwell writes, "When the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys." This line strongly echoes ideas about the ethics of the oppressor discussed by philosophers like Albert Camus and Frantz Fanon. Camus, for example, in The Rebel, insists that tyranny is never one-sided. The tyrant is trapped in his own role, condemned to keep up the theatre of force, even if it means killing for no reason, lying non-stop, or destroying what he himself values. Fanon, analysing French colonialism in Algeria, goes even further. He says the colonizer, by denying the humanity of the colonized, mutilates his own humanity. Orwell had already sensed this back in the 1920s, and his perception wasn't theoretical. It was lived. He was there in uniform, armed, under the gaze of thousands of people. And there he learned that authority, when grounded in symbolic and real violence, demands that the individual give up his conscience. That is the price of domination. In another passage from the essay, Orwell confesses, "I did not in the least want to shoot him, but I had got to act quickly. I was only an absurd puppet. I had to shoot the elephant." He feels like a puppet, acting against his own will. And then he adds the image that sums up the whole tragedy. He wears a mask, and his face grows to fit it. This image of the mask that grows into the face has a strong connection with existentialist philosophy. Decades later, Jean-Paul Sartre would talk about bad faith, the condition in which a person betrays themselves by living entirely according to a social role, denying their own freedom. Orwell lived this bad faith in the colonial field. He wasn't free because the system demanded that he act against his will, against his morals, against his clarity, and the more he obeyed, the farther he moved from himself. Colonial authority, then, isn't just a political structure. It's also psychological, ethical, and philosophical. It demands that a person give up authenticity in the name of an order based on forced superiority. Orwell, still very young, realized that domination built on violence destroys the very idea of truth. It turns people into caricatures of power, prisoners of the fear of looking weak. This is a key part of his critique. The empire doesn't survive only on guns and decrees. It survives on shame, insecurity, and performance. The one in power needs to look strong, even when he is full of doubt. He needs to act, even when he knows he's wrong. The killing of the elephant is just the visible example of a much deeper daily tragedy, the destruction of moral judgment. Here, we can connect his experience to Michel Foucault. Years later, Foucault would write that modern power is not exercised only over bodies, but over souls, over consciousness, over subjectivity. Orwell, without Foucault's technical vocabulary, already felt this. The colonial experience shaped the person from the inside out. It wasn't enough to obey, you had to become the role. This clash between inner life and outer role is what created in Orwell the feeling he would later call colonial guilt. When he returned to England, leaving the police and the empire behind, Orwell didn't celebrate his freedom. Instead, he entered a kind of personal journey of atonement. He knew that, in some way, he had been stained, and that his future criticism couldn't come from a neutral place, but from someone who had once been part of the machine. That level of self-awareness is rare and powerful. Many people who denounce a system speak from the outside. Orwell spoke from the inside. He had lived power, which is why he could expose it with such authority, not as a moralist pointing fingers, but as someone who carried internal scars. The anguish he felt when killing the elephant would become a symbol of what he would later witness on a much larger scale: the death of truth under the weight of authority. Orwell learned in Burma that power has to lie in order to keep existing. It has to create a stage of strength, and whoever steps onto that stage doesn't walk away untouched, not as an actor and not as a spectator. That is the philosophical core of the essay. Power based on mutual domination alienates everyone: the oppressed, who live under force, and the oppressor, who lives under the fear of looking weak. At just a little over 20 years old, Orwell left Burma with a conviction that would stay with him for life. There is no such thing as just authority when it rests on dehumanization. The colonial experience taught him that the true enemy wasn't only the empire itself, but the logic that turns human beings into gears in an impersonal system. And that was only the beginning. But there, in the thick Burmese forest, standing in front of a dying elephant, Orwell started to see what few dare to see: that sometimes power demands that we kill, not just the other, but parts of ourselves. In 1933, George Orwell published his first major work, Down and Out in Paris and London. It wasn't a novel, and it wasn't a traditional essay. It was something between a diary and a report, a deep dive into urban poverty in the two biggest cities in Western Europe. But more than a social chronicle, this book is a radical philosophical experience, a conscious effort to understand poverty not from the outside, but from the inside, breaking the wall of alienation that separates social classes. What makes this book so powerful is that Orwell doesn't just observe misery, he lives it. By choice, he throws himself into destitution. He goes hungry, sleeps in public shelters, works as a dishwasher in filthy kitchens, walks the streets as a beggar, and shares daily life with precarious workers, immigrants, and people forgotten by the system. This choice is anything but common. Most writers write about the poor. Orwell writes with the poor, among them, and in that gesture we find one of his first fundamental ethical lessons. Truth cannot be reached from a distance. To understand someone else's suffering, it's not enough to analyze it. You have to, in some way, share it. This idea has deep roots in moral philosophy. Emmanuel Levinas, for example, talks about the face of the other as the source of ethics. It's when we stand before the vulnerability of another person that responsibility is born, and that's exactly what Orwell does. He chooses to look at the face of poverty without the ideological filters of the press, politics, or academia. He strips himself of his privilege, even if temporarily, to experience the bare life of those who live on the margins. But this experience is not just social immersion. It's also a philosophical deconstruction. Orwell doesn't look for heroism in poverty or for spiritual purity. Quite the opposite. He shows misery as dehumanizing, exhausting, boring, and crushing. A system that wears down the spirit, erases dignity, and turns people into things, invisible cogs in an economy that depends at its core on the existence of the very poor. He describes, for example, the kitchen workers in Parisian luxury hotels, exhausted men, poorly paid, treated like trash. Yet they are the ones who keep the appearance of elegance going for the rich. This is one of the book's most brutal images. The comfort of the elite is literally built on the sweat and silence of the invisible. It's a moral critique that anticipates ideas that would later become central for thinkers like Pierre Bourdieu and Slavoj Žižek. Dominant culture is only possible because somewhere, someone is paying the price with their life. By exposing this structure, Orwell starts to shape what will become the ethical backbone of his work. Injustice is not just a matter of numbers or statistics. It is a moral failure. And misery, far from being an accident, is a necessary part of how capitalism works as a system. Many times he points to class alienation, the way capitalist societies create parallel worlds for the rich and the poor, not just economically, but culturally and existentially. A middle-class person can live their whole life without ever having a real conversation with a homeless person. An aristocrat can eat in restaurants whose workers don't know what rest feels like. This separation creates an ethical ignorance that allows the elite to keep living as if nothing were wrong. Orwell tears this veil. He shows how the system produces not only material inequality, but also moral indifference. And it's this indifference that bothers him the most. It's not only the suffering itself, but the fact that this suffering is invisible, tolerated, and normalized, as if poverty were just part of the scenery. That's why his writing in this book is direct, honest, almost brutal. He doesn't want to convince us with rhetoric, but with reality. He wants us to see what he saw, to feel what he felt. Orwell's philosophy here is not theoretical, it's lived. He invites us to think with the body, with an empty stomach, with aching feet, with the exhaustion of someone who walks for hours just to get a bowl of soup. This method is similar to Socrates, who taught in the streets, in the public square, through real encounters with people. It also connects with the practical philosophy of the ancient cynics, like Diogenes, who rejected comfort and lived with the bare minimum to expose society's excesses. Orwell, in his own way, is a modern cynic, not out of contempt, but out of the courage to expose the open wound of civilization. One of the most striking parts of the book is how he describes public shelters in London. The rules, the surveillance, the inhuman treatment. Orwell shows how the system makes a point of reminding poor people that they have no value. Even when offering charity or shelter, society imposes a logic of programmed humiliation, as if charity could only exist alongside contempt. This leads us to a deep reflection on the role of ethics in social policy. As Hannah Arendt would later warn, compassion without justice turns into paternalism. And Orwell already sensed this. He knew that real change would not come from the kindness of the rich, but from a radical reorganization of the structures that produce misery. At the same time, Orwell resists idealizing poverty. He doesn't romanticize suffering or assign moral purity to the poor. He sees them as human, with contradictions, flaws, violence, and beauty. This makes his analysis even more honest. He doesn't build a us versus them, but rather a we are all trapped in a cruel system. At this point, his critique of capitalism starts to gain deeper ethical and philosophical shape. For Orwell, the central problem of capitalism is not just the concentration of wealth, it's the way society is organized around indifference, a system where efficiency matters more than dignity, productivity more than compassion, where being economically useful matters more than being human. This critique gets close to humanist Marxist ethics, especially that of the young Karl Marx in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. The idea that capitalism alienates human beings not only from the product of their work, but from their own essence, from their creativity, freedom, and ability to recognize themselves in others. Orwell was never an orthodox Marxist, but here he comes close to that view. He sees poverty as the result of a system that disconnects people from their own humanity, and he understands that change cannot be only economic. It has to be moral. It has to rebuild empathy, listening, and real solidarity. That's why Down and Out in Paris and London is much more than a social report. It is an ethical act of denunciation, a call to conscience. Orwell shows us that misery is not the failure of an individual, but of the collective, and that ignoring it is quietly accepting structural violence as normal. The philosophical strength of the book lies in its ability to pull us out of our comfort, to show us that there are lives holding ours up, invisible, exploited, silenced, and that ethics begins when we open our eyes to this truth. Here, Orwell begins a journey that will stay with him all the way to 1984, the fight against systems that dehumanize. But before he could confront the totalitarianism of the future, He had to face the everyday banality of present-day suffering. Because for him, freedom doesn't begin with laws. It begins with empathy. And truth doesn't begin with data. It begins with bodies, with voices, with forgotten faces. In the 1930s, George Orwell hits a turning point. After his experience as an imperial policeman in Burma and his voluntary immersion in the poverty of the streets of Paris and London, he emerges as something rare. A writer who chooses to live on the edge of society, an intellectual who rejects the comfort of ideological circles and chooses the raw ground of lived experience. This is when his outsider's gaze is born. The gaze of a social observer who stands outside partisan and ideological trenches to try to see the human condition more clearly in times of crisis. This gaze isn't just aesthetic or literary. It's a philosophical stance, deeply ethical, that refuses to sacrifice truth in exchange for comfort, belonging, or doctrinal consistency. Orwell begins to distrust ready-made certainties and develops a radical skepticism, not as a denial of reality, but as a tool to resist manipulation, ideological blindness, and institutionalized lies. It's important to understand the historical context of the 1930s. The world was living through the aftermath of the Great Depression, the rise of fascism in Europe, the consolidation of Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and the collapse of liberal democracies. It was an age of extreme ideological polarization. Intellectuals were almost always pressured to pick a side: revolutionary socialism, authoritarian nationalism, or a dying liberalism. But Orwell didn't fit any clean label. He didn't want to repeat party slogans or protect uncomfortable truths in the name of ideological loyalty. His loyalty was to reality, and that put him on a collision course with every camp. During this time, Orwell distances himself from traditional intellectual circles. He chooses to live among workers, miners, the unemployed, immigrants. He travels through the industrial north of England, visits working-class neighborhoods, joins strikes, and starts writing reports, essays, and novels based on what he sees firsthand. Out of this experience comes The Road to Wigan Pier, 1937, a landmark in his career. In that book, Orwell describes in detail the brutal daily life of workers in northern England. He doesn't just expose the miserable housing and working conditions. He also points to something deeper, the almost unbridgeable gap between social classes and the moral hypocrisy of progressive elites. Orwell criticizes not only the capitalist system, but also the drawing room socialists, those who defend revolution with clean hands and warm feet. Here we see one of Orwell's greatest philosophical strengths, his ability to unsettle everyone, including his own supposed allies. He doesn't hesitate to say that many left-wing intellectuals secretly despise the very poor they claim to defend. According to him, there is a kind of fetishization of the proletariat that turns workers into mythical figures while avoiding listening to their real voices, their contradictions, fears, and desires. This criticism turns him into a loner in the world of ideas, someone who refuses to be absorbed by any closed system of thought. Orwell begins to see that every ideology, no matter how liberating it looks at first, tends to degenerate into dogma when it shuts itself off from reality. And it's exactly this closing off that he fights with growing intensity. It's here that his philosophical skepticism becomes solid. But it's important to be clear. Orwell is not a nihilist. He doesn't deny the possibility of justice or truth. On the contrary, he deeply believes in values like freedom, empathy, and honesty. What he rejects is letting dogma replace truth. He sees that ideology, once it becomes absolute, demands that reality be sacrificed in order to preserve its inner coherence. This criticism aligns closely with the tradition of critical thought, like that of Karl Popper, who would later argue that totalitarianism grows out of a claim to absolute truth. Orwell watches this happen in real time, especially in how European left-wing circles refuse to criticize the abuses of the Stalinist regime for fear of weakening the cause. But for Orwell, the cause can't justify the lie. Factual truth, for him, is non-negotiable, even if it hurts, even if it offends, even if it leaves you standing alone. In The Road to Wigan Pier, he writes, "The real question is not whether socialism is right or wrong. The question is whether socialists can face up to the truth about themselves." This kind of statement reveals the deep ethical commitment that drives Orwell. He knows that social transformation without honesty is just another form of domination. He begins to understand that ideological systems often only swap out who's on top, while leaving the machinery of manipulation intact. That's why he embraces the role of outsider. Not as an aesthetic pose, but as a moral necessity. He knows that to see clearly, you have to stand a little bit outside. That doesn't mean being neutral or indifferent, but keeping enough distance to think beyond ideological trenches. This outsider's gaze has huge philosophical value. It echoes Adam Smith's idea of the impartial spectator, but also the marginal intellectual, described by Edward Said. Both figures show that real criticism usually comes from a place of discomfort, from people who don't fully belong to the centers of power or to the comfort of rigid certainties. Orwell understands this in his own flesh. He doesn't feel at home among conservatives, but he also doesn't see himself in dogmatic Marxists. He writes as someone standing between worlds, and that's exactly why his thinking cuts so deep. He doesn't defend a closed ideology. He defends the possibility of thinking freely, even in dark times. At this point, his philosophy comes close to Camus' existentialism. Both share a radical distrust of easy solutions and a deep belief in individual responsibility. Camus would later say that the truly rebellious man is the one who says no to injustice, but also yes to clarity. Orwell lives inside this tension all the time, saying no to the lies of the system without slipping into nihilism or apathy. This stance, however, comes at a cost. Orwell faces rejection, criticism, and loneliness, but he doesn't back down. His intellectual integrity becomes his weapon, and his role as outsider turns into a kind of model, the thinker who refuses to betray reality in the name of ideological convenience. That's why his work still speaks so strongly today. Orwell writes as someone who feels accountable to the truth, not to parties, not to audiences. And that's what makes him so necessary. He reminds us that thinking requires courage, that seeing the world as it is, not as we wish it were, is the first step toward any real ethical change. In the 1930s, Orwell planted the seeds of what would later bloom in Animal Farm and 1984. The fight for clarity, for lucidity, against manipulation. But before the dystopias came the gaze of someone who chose the margins, not out of resentment, but out of responsibility. A gaze that refused the comfort of lies and chose the difficult, but liberating, company of the truth. In December 1936, George Orwell crossed into Spain with a purpose that carried both an ethical impulse and a political hope: to fight against fascism. The Spanish Civil War had begun a few months earlier, with the attempted military coup led by Francisco Franco against the newly elected Spanish Republic. The world was watching, but few were getting directly involved. Orwell didn't hesitate. He went to war not as a reporter, not as a distant observer, but as a volunteer fighter, driven by what he believed might be the last chance to stop fascism from spreading across Europe. But what he found in Spain wasn't just the violence of the battlefield. What Orwell saw, and lived, was the betrayal of revolutionary idealism by the left itself, which, in the middle of the war, began censoring, hunting down, and erasing those who thought differently inside the Republican side. It was there, in the dust of the trenches, and in the fear of his own allies, that Orwell faced a devastating realization. Political manipulation doesn't come only from the enemy. It also grows from within. Orwell arrived in Barcelona full of enthusiasm. He found a city in political upheaval, taken over by revolutionary forces, armed workers, unions in control of factories, emptied churches, and hope in the streets. The sight of an egalitarian society being built by ordinary people moved him deeply. Later, he would say, "For the first time in my life, I saw the working class in the saddle. Everything seemed too honest to be true." And in fact, it wasn't. Orwell enlisted in the militia of the POUM, Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, a revolutionary left-wing organization that was anti-Stalinist. And that detail would change everything. While he was fighting in the trenches against Franco's forces, Orwell began to notice signs of a new enemy. Less visible, but just as dangerous. The internal repression led by the communists aligned with the Soviet Union. The Civil War was not just a battle between fascists and anti-fascists. It was also a war between factions on the left itself. A bloody struggle over who would control the narrative, the power, and the revolution. Back in Barcelona, behind the front lines, the police controlled by the Communist Party began arresting POUM members, shutting down independent newspapers, and spreading rumors that Trotskyists were collaborating with the fascists. Orwell saw friends disappear, heard lies being repeated as truth, and realized, in shock, that the same propaganda machine he opposed in fascism was being used by the authoritarian left. This is the moment when the ethical core of his later work is fully born. Orwell understood that it's not enough to fight external tyranny if you don't stay alert to the tyranny growing inside your own side. Once ideological lies are accepted as a method of political control, they poison any cause, even the most just one. This experience took literary and philosophical shape in his memoir masterpiece, Homage to Catalonia, 1938. The book is more than a war story. It is a painful denunciation of how ideological politics will sacrifice truth to keep control of the narrative. Orwell writes, "The official history of the Civil War is being written not according to the facts, but according to what suits party interests. And whoever controls the past controls the present." That line directly anticipates the logic of the Ministry of Truth in 1984. But before it became fiction, it was already real in Spain. From a philosophical point of view, what's at stake here is an ethics of truth. Orwell realizes that political struggle that ignores concrete facts in the name of some higher truth, whether that's the revolution, the party, or progress, is doomed to end in tyranny. He positions himself against the old Machiavellian idea that the ends justify the means. For Orwell, once the means become corrupt, they corrupt the ends as well. This moves him away for good from orthodox communism. He doesn't become a right-wing anti-communist. Instead, he becomes an independent socialist, someone who still believes in a just society but is deeply suspicious of any authoritarian centralism. He starts seeing individual freedom as a non-negotiable value, even inside collective struggle. In this sense, Orwell comes very close to philosophers like Albert Camus, especially in The Rebel, where Camus argues that any ethical revolt has to include its own moral limits, a revolution that devours its own children, that turns heroes into traitors, that rewrites facts to protect the ideology. That kind of revolution isn't liberation. It's just a new form of slavery. Orwell lived this personally. When he and his wife were accused of having Trotskyist sympathies, they had to flee Spain in fear of prison or execution, not from the fascists, but from their own comrades on the left. That escape didn't kill his hope for social justice, but it made him much more aware that moral vigilance has to be constant, even among those who claim to be fighting for freedom. What makes this phase of Orwell's life so striking is his refusal to lie in order to protect his political image. He knew that telling the truth about what he saw in Spain would make him a target of criticism, distrust, and isolation. But he also knew that moral integrity starts exactly when you choose truth over convenience. And here is one of the biggest philosophical lessons we can take from this experience. Truth is not a tool of ideology. It is what makes any honest ideology possible in the first place. Without truth, no revolution can be just. Without facts, politics turns into theatre, and Orwell refuses to be an actor in any lie. His skepticism grows up. He stops believing that any ideology, no matter how noble it sounds, can be trusted if it isn't anchored in honesty. He no longer believes in parties as saviors. He puts his faith instead in individual conscience, critical thinking, a free press, and constant vigilance against abuse of power, wherever it comes from. Orwell also understands that political manipulation doesn't only show up through brute force, but through control of language and narrative. Censorship, propaganda, the twisting of facts, all of these, he realizes, are weapons of war just as powerful as bombs. And they are used not only by enemies, but also by those who claim to be on the right side. This insight, that truth is the first victim of authoritarian ideology, makes Orwell a unique figure in 20th century political literature. He doesn't write to flatter factions. He writes to wake people up. The Spanish Civil War marks him as a witness to a tragic disappointment, but also as a thinker who refuses to betray reality, even when reality crushes his own hopes. What Orwell went through in Spain still resonates today. In times of polarization, extremism, and narratives that sacrifice truth in the name of the cause, his ethical stance remains current. See, think, question. And if needed, break with your own allies when they walk away from the truth. For him, the Spanish Civil War was more than a combat experience. It was the laboratory where he discovered that the real enemy of freedom is not only the tyrant in uniform, but also the ally who censors, manipulates, and lies in the name of a greater good. And it was from that wound that Orwell began to build the moral framework that would support his most powerful works. When George Orwell came back from the Spanish Civil War in 1937, he didn't return with medals, glory, or ideological praise. He came back with a fever, a bullet wound in his neck, and a deep sense of disappointment. The realization that even the most just causes can be corrupted when truth is sacrificed in the name of propaganda. That experience reshaped him and gave birth to the book that would seal his ethics as a writer and political thinker. Homage to Catalonia. Published in 1938, the book is a direct, visceral, and honest account of his time in the war. But it's much more than a trench memoir. It's the first clear manifesto of his ethics of truth, a stance radically committed to facts, even when they bother people, isolate him, or upset his own allies. From that point on, Orwell chose to live as a guardian of reality, refusing any narrative that twisted events just to serve an ideology. That decision was anything but comfortable. While most of the European left stayed quiet about the contradictions of Stalinism so as not to weaken the anti-fascist cause, Orwell did the opposite. He wrote the uncomfortable truth with the clarity of someone who prefers honesty over status. He had seen the front lines up close and, even more than that, the backstage of manipulation. He saw communist newspapers lie about betrayals that never happened, saw revolutionary leaders slandered and jailed by other revolutionaries, and saw the complicit silence of many who preferred to protect the party instead of protecting the truth. In Homage to Catalonia, Orwell writes with bitterness, but also with sharp clarity. The whole history of the Spanish Civil War is being written under the sign of the lie. That line isn't just a political comment. It's an ethical indictment. Orwell understood that organized, systematic, ideological lying is one of the most destructive tools in modern politics. It doesn't just confuse facts, it rebuilds the symbolic world, redefines who is a hero and who is a traitor, erases names from memory, and rewrites the past according to what the present needs. This is the moment when the Orwellian ethic of truth as a moral duty fully takes shape. For Orwell, truth is not some academic luxury. It's the only possible foundation for freedom and justice. He doesn't believe in political relativism or class truths. Truth for him is concrete, objective, and checkable. And it has to be defended even against your own side, if that's what it takes. Here, Orwell walks away for good from ideological utopias. He understands that every ideology, even the most well-intentioned, runs the risk of turning into a machine of concealment. What was supposed to be a means to free people almost inevitably becomes an end in itself, demanding that reality be falsified so it can stay standing. That leads him to a rare position among intellectuals of his time: the courage to upset the entire political spectrum in the name of factual integrity. Philosophically, this ethic echoes thinkers like Immanuel Kant, for whom truth is an unconditional duty, a moral requirement that cannot be bent for convenience. Kant wrote that telling the truth must be treated as a basic duty underlying any system of law. Orwell, though more political than metaphysical, shares that same conviction. When we accept lying as a political method, we don't just damage knowledge, we destroy the very possibility of freedom. And this is where his contrast with the totalitarian regimes he would later criticize becomes clear. For Orwell, totalitarianism doesn't start with physical violence. It starts with the manipulation of language, the taming of thought, the normalization of lying. What he saw in Spain was a preview of that. A regime that hadn't even won the war yet, but was already rewriting facts to control people's minds. This awareness of the power of language becomes central in his work. Orwell understands that whoever controls the narrative controls social reality, and political propaganda, when swallowed without question, has the power to turn people's eyes against the facts themselves, until nobody knows what's real and what's made up. That's why he refuses to idealize any side. In Homage to Catalonia, he doesn't spare the Francoists or the Stalinists, but he also doesn't fall into nihilism. He doesn't give up on the idea of justice. He simply understands that justice is only possible if it's paired with intellectual honesty. In one of the book's most striking passages, Orwell basically says, "I saw things that made me understand what a political lie really is. When a party lies systematically to protect its image, it's no better than the enemy it fights." This thought anticipates the core of 1984, the picture of a system where lying is built in, where thought itself is shaped by propaganda, and where the past is constantly rewritten to justify the present. But in 1937, Orwell wasn't writing dystopias yet. He was writing with fresh wounds, with the trauma of seeing friends persecuted, with the anger of someone who felt betrayed not by the enemy, but by his own side. Ethically, this may be the hardest position to take, the person who calls out the mistakes of their own camp. Not out of cowardice, but out of integrity. Not because they want to abandon the cause, but because they want to save it from rotting from the inside. Orwell believed that without truth, the left would lose its soul, and for that reason, he didn't hesitate to take on a lonely, but honest, stance. That ethical loneliness marks him deeply. Orwell would never again trust any ideological structure blindly. From then on, all his intellectual work would be guided by one central principle: tell the truth, even when everyone else is lying, and especially when everyone else is lying. He becomes a troubling figure in politics, not because he's vague or confused, but because he is too consistent. He doesn't bargain with truth. He believes that the first duty of any public thinker is to the facts, not to applause. That's the strength of his ethics. It doesn't bend to convenience or to silent complicity. And that's exactly why it still matters today. In an age of fake news, historical revisionism, echo chambers, and post-truth, Orwell's stance is still a beacon. Truth is a moral duty, and when we abandon it, we lose more than reality. We lose freedom. In that sense, Homage to Catalonia is not just a political book, it's a philosophical milestone. It's the work in which Orwell recognizes himself not only as a writer, but as a moral witness of his time. Someone who saw manipulation from the inside, survived it, and decided, from that moment on, to turn language itself into a tool of resistance. After his experiences in the Spanish Civil War, George Orwell stopped being just a writer alert to social injustice. He became a philosophical critic of political utopias. And what develops in his work and thought from 1937 onward is a warning that's still relevant today. Every utopia, when it tries to impose itself through force or lies, ends up betraying the very ideals that created it. At first, Orwell was not against the idea of socialism. Quite the opposite. In his youth, and even in his early writings, he saw socialism as the only ethical alternative to the brutal capitalism he had felt on his own skin in Down and Out, in Paris and London, and the road to Wigan Pier. Poverty, unemployment, inequality, and the alienation of the working classes were, for him, symptoms of a broken economic system. Like many in his generation, he believed social transformation was necessary and urgent. However, what Orwell witnessed in Spain, the left repressing the left, censorship, executions without trial, the manipulation of history in real time, shattered any remaining revolutionary romanticism. That's when his deep philosophical distrust of utopias began. For Orwell, the core problem wasn't the dream of a better society. The problem was how that dream was used as an excuse to justify crimes, lies, and authoritarianism. Once a utopia becomes absolute, it closes itself off from the real world and turns into an ideology that demands total obedience, not just of bodies, but of minds. This criticism doesn't come only from abstract analysis. It comes from what he actually saw and lived, from direct contact with political repression. Orwell understood that authoritarian socialism, centralized, bureaucratic, and willing to silence any internal criticism, was not a solution to capitalism, but simply a new form of oppression. That realization led him to a new vision, a democratic socialism rooted in individual freedom, transparency, and resistance to all forms of tyranny, including tyranny in the name of equality. From that point on, Orwell follows a lonely political path. He is a socialist, but fiercely anti-totalitarian. He is a critic of capitalism, but just as critical of a state bureaucracy that, in the name of the people, turns people into an obedient mass. Philosophically, this position is very close to Karl Popper's thought in The Open Society and Its Enemies, where Popper denounces the utopian tradition as an enemy of freedom. For Popper, any attempt to build heaven on earth tends to turn into violent social engineering, where the ends justify any means. Orwell was already living that in practice, even before Popper's work became widely known. For Orwell, utopia loses its ethical force the moment it demands the suspension of criticism, when loyalty to the party becomes more important than loyalty to the facts. When freedom is endlessly postponed in the name of some revolutionary tomorrow that never come. He starts to see that regimes calling themselves transitional, like dictatorships of the proletariat, often settle in permanently and use their supposed transitional nature as an excuse to keep people under control. That's one of the reasons he starts writing more and more clearly about individual freedom as a non-negotiable value. A utopia that demands silence is no longer a promise of justice. It's a project of domination. In The Road to Wigan Pier, this tension is already visible. Orwell attacks capitalism harshly, but he also unleashes a fierce critique on certain sectors of the British left. With a mix of irony and frustration, he talks about socialists who don't actually like real people, only an abstract idea of the working class. He calls out the intellectual arrogance of those who claim to defend the poor, but secretly despise their culture, their habits, and their way of speaking. This philosophical critique of elitist utopia is actually a call for moral realism. Orwell reminds us that any politics that ignores real human beings, with their contradictions, emotions, and freedom, is doomed to ethical failure. It's not enough to want to change the world. You can't betray your principles in the process. Orwell begins to ask himself, is it worth building an equal society if, to do that, you have to abolish freedom of thought, open debate, and factual truth? His answer is clear. No, because without freedom, equality is just a facade. It's submission wearing a mask. From this turning point onward, his work starts to take on the tone that would make him one of the most influential political writers of the 20th century. His satire, his irony, his constant watchfulness against abuses of power, all of that comes from his refusal to accept that a new tyranny is better than the old one just because it carries different flags. It's in this period that Orwell begins to lay the foundations for his most powerful works, Animal Farm and 1984, which would be written later but are already foreshadowed in this ethical skepticism toward authoritarian utopia. His distrust widens. He sees that state bureaucracy, far from being just a necessary evil, can turn into an impersonal machine of dehumanization, where decisions are made with no face, no accountability, no empathy. He denounces the coldness of a state that manages human lives like statistics, a state that speaks in the name of the people, but acts like a machine. And when it is not challenged, ends up swallowing the very population it claims to represent. This criticism carries an existential weight. Orwell understands that human beings cannot be reduced to a 5-year plan, a production quota, or a line on a chart. What he defends, more than any system, is the dignity of individual conscience. A socialism that doesn't respect that, for him, is just another form of slavery. So his goal is not to destroy the idea of a better world. It's to insist that this world be built without sacrificing what makes us human, the freedom to think, to speak, to disagree. Orwell rejects rigid utopia and starts defending a more modest ideal of justice, one that is more attentive to the complexity of reality and to human flaws. In a sense, he anticipates some of Hannah Arendt's thinking when she later warns about the dangers of replacing genuine political action with totalizing ideological systems. Both understand that power, when concentrated and unchecked, tends toward lies, exclusion, and violence, even when it's wrapped in the language of emancipation. Orwell then positions himself as a lone voice saying, yes, it is possible to dream of a better world, but that dream is only legitimate if it is lived with honesty, with constant self-critique, and without trampling freedom in the name of efficiency. He starts defending a democratic, decentralized, transparent socialism that stays close to people's real needs. A socialism that doesn't replace the tyranny of capital with the tyranny of the party, but tries to rescue the best of both worlds, social justice with individual freedom. This is his utopia without utopia. An ethical project for the world that doesn't promise paradise, but commits to decency, truth, and constant vigilance against power. And it was by following this path that Orwell built his greatest kind of authority. Not the authority of someone who says, I have the answers, but of someone who says, I won't accept lies, no matter where they come from. Between the horrors of World War II and the still smouldering ruins of the First, George Orwell witnessed a silent but devastating shift. Truth started being treated as a tactical variable, something that could be adjusted depending on the needs of the moment. War, he realized, was no longer just a clash of armies and territories. It was a battle over language, narrative, and collective memory. And on this symbolic battlefield, propaganda became one of the most effective weapons of the 20th century. During the war years, Orwell worked as a journalist, essayist, and editor. He worked for the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, writing and broadcasting programs for audiences in India and Southeast Asia. He also wrote for the newspaper Tribune and produced a series of essays that today are key to understanding the relationship between politics, language, and truth. But it didn't take long for him to notice a cruel irony. Even on the side of the good guys, the Western democracies fighting Nazism, truth was far from an absolute value. Orwell, who always defended freedom of speech, found himself surrounded by distortions, selective censorship, and half-truths. War, as he would later say, is a time when lying becomes a patriotic duty. That feeling shows up strongly in his writing from 1940 to 1945. In one of his most important essays from this period, looking back on the Spanish War, Orwell writes, I have seen great events that never happened reported as facts, while undeniable events have been allowed to slip into oblivion. That line, written during World War II, wasn't only about the Spanish Civil War. It summed up a new logic in the modern world, where what matters is not what actually happened, but what can be said to have happened. Language stops being a bridge between reality and awareness and becomes a tool of control, shaped by political interests. Here, Orwell starts to develop the philosophical core of his critique of language as an instrument of domination. He understands that it's not just about telling lies, it's about building a whole alternate symbolic universe, where concepts are redefined, words are emptied out or reprogrammed, and people's sense of reality itself is shaped by whoever controls the media. This idea strongly echoes what Michel Foucault would develop later. Discourse isn't neutral, it's a form of power. But Orwell was already seeing this in the 1940s, even without academic language. He could see that the way governments described events, the words they chose, the calculated silences, the euphemisms, was itself a battlefield. As a journalist, Orwell had a front-row seat to how information was handled. He saw how war reports were edited, how headlines were built to generate support, how symbolic victories were manufactured to keep morale high. He noticed that truth was being measured out according to political usefulness, as if honesty could be negotiated in the name of national stability. In one of his clearest texts, Politics in the English Language, 1946, Orwell attacks the way political language turns into a code meant to blur reality instead of clarify. Words like democracy, freedom, and justice become vague, stretchy, sometimes even contradictory. Language turns into a smokescreen, not to explain, but to hide. He writes, "Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind." That's a powerful accusation, not just against one government, but against the very degradation of language in modern politics. For Orwell, this kind of language doesn't just fool other people, it destroys the speaker's own ability to think clearly. Language shapes thought. And when language is corrupted, thought becomes tame, predictable, easy to manipulate. His critique gets sharper in the final years of the war. Orwell observes that the liberal democracies are increasingly willing to adopt the tactics of their authoritarian enemies, as long as it helps them win. The line between truth and propaganda gets thinner and thinner, and Orwell is disturbed by how easily people accept this as normal. In his columns, he laments that most people don't want the truth, they want to be told they're on the right side. That marks a turning point in his thinking. Truth isn't only something that needs to be defended against governments, but also against our own desire to believe comforting illusions. Orwell realizes that the most effective propaganda is the kind that doesn't look like propaganda. It shows up as information, patriotism, common sense. It's the lie dressed up as morality, responsibility, and reason. And once this kind of manipulation becomes normal, it eats away at the foundations of democracy. Because a society that can't tell fact from fiction, reality from narrative, is a society ready for any kind of tyranny. This more mature line of thinking would become the backbone of 1984, but it's already clearly present in his wartime essays. The idea that controlling language is the first step to controlling minds. That censorship doesn't have to be brutal to work. It just has to be constant, gradual, and disguised as national interest. At this point, Orwell becomes more than a political commentator. He becomes a kind of philosopher of language. He starts to understand that totalitarian systems don't just impose laws, they impose a vocabulary, and by controlling the words, they shape what people can think, desire, or even imagine. During World War II, Orwell learned that the fight for truth is, at its core, a fight for language, and that protecting the integrity of words is a trench that has to be defended urgently. That's why he began writing in an increasingly direct, clear, stripped-down style, as if by simplifying language, he was trying to detox the reader's mind. That choice wasn't just stylistic, it was ethical. For Orwell, writing clearly was an act of resistance, a pushback against convenient vagueness, empty jargon, and the euphemisms that turn massacres into security operations. It was his way of trying to restore language to its original purpose, serving the truth. World War II taught Orwell that barbarism doesn't begin with bombs. It begins with false words. And any democracy that accepts twisting its own language in the name of stability is, in reality, clearing the path for dystopia. That lesson echoes even more strongly today. In an age of fake news, historical revisionism, echo chambers, and narrative wars, Orwell's philosophy of language is not just relevant, it's urgent. He reminds us that language is the ground where freedom either begins or dies. And if we really want to defend democracy, we first have to defend the honesty of the words we use to describe it. The book is an analysis of the cycle of revolutions, from idealism to tyranny. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. In 1945, right at the end of World War II, George Orwell published what would become one of the most symbolic and timeless works of the 20th century, Animal. Even though it's written as a fable with animal characters, and at first glance, almost a childlike tone, the book is actually a fierce philosophical critique of how power becomes corrupt, and how revolutionary ideals decay over time. Marked by his experiences in the Spanish Civil War and by watching authoritarianism hide behind the mask of liberation, Orwell turned into allegory what he had seen in real life. A just cause slowly turning into an oppressive regime fed by manipulation, fear, and lies. In the story, we follow the revolt of the animals on Manor Farm, who rise up against the tyrant, Mr. Jones, a negligent and exploitative farmer. Inspired by an egalitarian vision preached by the pig old major, the animals seize control of the farm and set up the principles of what they call animalism, an ideology based on equality and collective work. The banner is clear: all animals are equal. But over time, and this is the central tragedy of the book, the ideals of the revolution start to twist. The pigs, who were originally leaders by consensus, begin to take privileges. Little by little, rules are rewritten, promises are forgotten, and the old abuses come back under new excuses. By the end, the pigs are indistinguishable from the humans they replaced. The slogan that once celebrated equality is transformed into its ironic and cruel opposite. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. That sentence, which sounds absurd on purpose, is the high point of Orwell's critical philosophy. With it, he exposes the ideological mechanism that sustains tyranny. Language is twisted until abuse looks normal. Equality, which should be a solid principle, gets watered down and turned into a special privilege disguised as justice. In this sense, Animal Farm is more than a satire of Stalinism, even though it clearly is that too. It's a deep philosophical reflection on the cycle of political revolution. History shows, again and again, that revolutions are born out of noble ideals, freedom, justice, equality, but often end up rebuilding the same structures of oppression they promised to destroy. Orwell is quietly asking, why does this happen? Why does history seem doomed to repeat the same mistakes? Why does power, even in the hands of people who once suffered under it, tend to corrupt? The answer suggested by the book is complex, but we can sum it up like this. When power isn't watched, when it isn't shared, when it isn't grounded in firm ethical principles and a real culture of accountability, it starts to preserve itself at any cost, even if that means betraying its own foundations. This critique lines up with political thinkers like Lord Acton, who wrote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." But Orwell goes further. He shows that the corruption of power isn't just moral, it's also symbolic, narrative, and semantic. As the pigs consolidate themselves at the top, they don't just exploit the other animals, they also rewrite history, edit the commandments, and erase the collective memory. The manipulation of language, which Orwell had already attacked in his essays, appears here in a powerful literary form. Every change on the farm is matched by a small adjustment to the 7 commandments of animalism painted on the barn. When the pigs start sleeping in beds, the rule "no animal shall sleep in a bed" becomes "no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets." When they begin executing traitors, the commandment "no animal shall kill any other animal" becomes "no animal shall kill any other animal without cause." There's always a justification, always a new context, and the animal's memory is weak, confused, easy to manipulate. Here Orwell shows one of the pillars of his political philosophy, the danger of a manipulated memory. He understands that whoever controls the past controls the present, and whoever controls the present shapes the future. History stops being a record of truth and becomes a tool of domination. This will be even more explicit in 1984, but it's already fully developed in Animal Farm. The allegory also reveals Orwell's deep distrust of political messianism, the idea that one group, one elite or one party is the special guardian of historical truth. The problem, as he shows, is that when a class declares itself the leader of the revolution, it quickly moves away from real people and starts protecting itself, building walls and lying. The revolutionary ideal turns into doctrine, and doctrine turns into dogma. This process is captured brilliantly in the figures of Napoleon and Snowball. Napoleon represents the authoritarian leader who, behind a mask of discipline and order, concentrates power and gets rid of his rivals. Snowball represents the pragmatic idealist who is pushed out and later turned into a scapegoat, blamed for everything, even when he's not there. The revolution becomes permanently justified by an internal enemy, always needed to keep everyone scared and under control. It's the logic of political paranoia, typical of totalitarian regimes. By building this fable, Orwell also reminds us that when the masses are denied critical education, they become easy targets for manipulation. The horse boxer is the clearest example of this. He represents blind loyalty. His motto, "I will work harder," is moving but tragic. He believes in the revolution all the way to the end, even when it betrays him. And when he collapses, he is sold to the knacker by the very leaders he thought he was serving. That scene is one of the most painful in the book, and one of the most powerful philosophically. Orwell shows that voluntary servitude, as Etienne de la Boétie once wrote, is one of the hardest forms of oppression to fight, because it doesn't rest only on brute force. It rests on belief, on political faith, on the idea that one day it will all be worth it. And it's exactly that belief that tyrants exploit. They don't just need weapons, they need symbols, speeches, emotional loyalty. Orwell understands that totalitarianism doesn't survive only on repression. It feeds on hope, on affection, on the language of promises that never really come true. At the end of the book, when the animals look through the farmhouse window and can no longer tell pigs from humans, Orwell gives us his bitter conclusion. The revolution failed because it abandoned its principles, and power, without limits, always turns against the ones who granted it. Animal Farm is, therefore, a work that goes far beyond its time. It's not just a critique of Stalinism, but a warning about any system that calls itself liberating while refusing to be held accountable. Orwell shows that the real enemy of freedom is not only the obvious oppressor, but also the liberator who stops watching himself. The animal's fable still hits home today because it touches something essential. The desire for equality can be twisted by the desire for control, and when there's no criticism, there are no limits. The dream turns into a nightmare, and the oppressed of yesterday become the oppressors of today. After reading Animal Farm, many readers feel a kind of shock, not just because of the betrayal of ideals, but because of how political language gets twisted until ethics itself becomes unrecognizable. In that process, George Orwell shows us something deeper than a simple critique of totalitarianism. He shows how power, when it's concentrated and never questioned, animalizes politics. It drags moral thinking down to raw instincts of self-preservation, domination, and blind obedience. This animalization of politics is not a random metaphor. By choosing animals as the main characters of his fable, Orwell flips the perspective. The animals are humanized so we can see how humans are becoming less human. But as the story goes on, we realize the pigs aren't moving toward full humanity. They're moving toward a distorted, corrupted, twisted version of rationality. The pig Napoleon, for example, doesn't represent a civilized human being. He represents a human being without ethics, someone who uses reason only as a tool for power. The allegory exposes something political philosophy has pointed out for centuries. When politics cuts itself off from ethics, it moves closer to brute violence. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes warned that without shared moral rules, human society tends toward a war of all against all, where man is a wolf to man. Orwell, in his modern fable, suggests that this state isn't where we start. It's where we end up when a revolution abandons its moral core in the name of efficiency and control. On the farm, ideas of good and evil don't disappear. They're rewritten and repackaged to fit the leader's interests. Here, Orwell delivers one of his harshest critiques of authoritarian revolutionary ethics. Once power takes over language, it doesn't always need to repress. It can just redefine. Killing traitors is no longer murder. It's defending the revolution. Stealing is no longer exploitation. It's rational distribution of resources. Lying isn't deception. It's information management. The result is the collapse of ethics as we knew it. Right and wrong no longer rest on moral principles. They depend on the will of the party, the leader, the abstract collective. This moral distortion had already been explored by Dostoevsky in Demons and by Camus in The Rebel. But Orwell goes further by showing how this ethical flip can be accepted by the masses when it's told well enough. Under propaganda, politics turns into theatre. The point of speech is no longer to tell the truth, but to shape behaviour. And without noticing, the animals on the farm, and by analogy, the citizens in modern societies, stop thinking in terms of justice, compassion, or dignity. They start thinking only in terms of loyalty, productivity, and fear. That is the animalization of politics, when survival instincts take the place of ethical reflection. What matters is no longer what is right, but what is useful to the system. Morality doesn't vanish. It's replaced by a fake version, a set of mechanical rules and ideological slogans that reduce politics to obedient repetition of empty phrases. That's why Orwell pays so much attention to the role of language in this process. The destruction of ethics begins with the destruction of moral vocabulary. When words like equality, justice, and freedom start to mean the opposite of what they once meant, it's not just communication that breaks down. Our own conscience starts to fall apart. The phrase, "all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," is not just a joke. It's a demonstration of how moral thinking can be reshaped until it becomes absurd and still be accepted as normal. It's a kind of circular logic, where contradiction isn't seen as a problem, but as proof of authority. If the leaders say it's true, then it must be true, even if everyone quietly knows it's a lie. This break with critical thinking is what Orwell fears most, because once people lose the ability to question what they're told, power becomes absolute, not mainly through violence, but through internalized obedience. Physical fear gives way to fear of thinking differently, and once that happens, open repression becomes almost unnecessary. People censor themselves. It's important to see that Orwell is not condemning politics itself or the idea of revolution. What he's calling out is the loss of the ethical core that should guide any real social change. He's not cynical, and he's not simply conservative. For him, rebellion against injustice is still necessary, but it cannot betray the values that gave it life in the first place. This critique connects with thinkers who tried to keep politics and ethics tied together. Hannah Arendt, for example, warned about the dangers of ideological thinking that wipes out plurality and turns politics into a system of ready-made answers. For her, totalitarianism appears when people stop thinking for themselves, exactly what Orwell shows when he portrays the farm animals chanting slogans they don't really understand. Albert Camus also lines up with Orwell here. In The Rebel, Camus argues that every revolution needs to place limits on itself. Ethical revolt, for him, is the kind that refuses injustice, but also refuses to become unjust in return. Orwell shares that view. He understands that pure ideals are not enough. You need constant moral vigilance, especially when you're sure you're on the right side. So the animalization of politics is not just a literary device, it's a philosophical warning. Orwell shows that politics without ethics doesn't make us more rational. It makes us more tame. And that obedience without thought pushes us into an instinct-driven existence where fear replaces dialogue, repetition replaces reflection, and language turns into a tool for taming people. But Orwell's warning is not hopeless. By exposing this process so clearly, he also offers a kind of antidote, reclaiming language as a tool for critical thinking. The ability to name abuses, to spot contradictions, to remember the past accurately. All of this, in his view, is the foundation of resistance. In a world where ethics can be rewritten by decree, thinking independently is the greatest act of rebellion. And in this sense, Orwell doesn't just expose the corruption of power, he invites the reader to take back their own humanity. For him, politics deserves that name only when it serves truth, justice, and freedom of conscience. The collapse of revolutionary ethics is not, therefore, an unavoidable fate. It's a choice. And because it's a choice, it can be reversed. But only if language becomes a bridge again, not a barrier. Only if thinking recovers its place. And only if power goes back to being a tool, not an end in itself. When George Orwell started writing 1984, between 1946 and 1947, he wasn't just creating a dark story about some far-off future. He was turning his own life experience, marked by oppression, war, propaganda, and ideological disappointment, into a kind of philosophical system, embodied in a dystopian narrative. What came out of that process was more than a novel. It was a warning siren against modern totalitarianism, where mind control, constant surveillance, and the destruction of language become the pillars of a new kind of tyranny. 2 years before the book was published, Orwell was living almost alone on a small island in Scotland, fighting tuberculosis, physically worn out, but still determined to finish what he knew would be his political testament. The isolation, the constant cold, and the sense that death was getting closer gave the book an even more urgent tone. Orwell wrote knowing his time was short, but he felt the truths he wanted to record would outlive him. The post-World War II world was literally split into 2 blocks. Stalin's Soviet Union had come out of the war as a victor, but inside it was a brutal dictatorship. On the other side, the US and its allies presented themselves as defenders of freedom, while building a military and propaganda machine that, in Orwell's eyes, wasn't as different as they liked to claim. He saw totalitarian danger not as something tied to one side or one ideology, but as a modern logic of power, cross-cutting, subtle, and increasingly tied to technology. 1984 is born out of that understanding, but it doesn't come only from theory. Orwell poured into the book his first-hand experiences with authoritarian repression from the left in the Spanish Civil War, with media manipulation during World War II, and with the decay of political language he had already described in essays like Politics and the English Language. In the novel, all of this is reorganized into a complete system of control. The main character, Winston Smith, lives in a society where the party doesn't just control bodies, it controls minds. It rewrites the past, controls language, and watches people's thoughts. It's a world where reality itself is flexible, feelings are tamed, and rebellion is crushed before it even fully takes shape. It's important to notice that Orwell doesn't create a cartoon villain. Big Brother, who sees everything, doesn't even need to show up in person to exercise power. He exists as an image, as internalized surveillance, as an idea. Here, Orwell very clearly anticipates debates that only became mainstream decades later with Michel Foucault. Modern power doesn't have to be embodied in a single dictator. It's spread through systems, institutions, routines, and words. The building of this dystopia is deeply autobiographical. The experience of being watched in Spain, of seeing history being rewritten in real time, of watching friends disappear because they disagreed with the official line. All of this comes back in 1984 in condensed and symbolic form. When Orwell shows Winston working in the Ministry of Truth, altering old documents to keep the party's story consistent, he's really calling out the erasing of history he had personally witnessed. Language manipulation is another central pillar of the book and one of the most powerful philosophical critiques ever written on the topic. Orwell invents newspeak, an artificial language created by the party to limit people's ability to think critically. By shrinking the vocabulary and flattening meanings, the party hopes that ideas like freedom, justice, or rebellion will eventually become literally unthinkable. This isn't just a clever literary invention, it's a radical reflection on how language shapes thought. Orwell anticipates key ideas from 20th century philosophy of language. If we can't name a concept, we can't really think it through. So repression isn't just physical or ideological, it's cognitive. 1984 shows that the deepest level of control is not the prison of the body, but the shrinking of the imagination. At this point, the book lines up with thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Newspeak is the dark, practical version of that idea. A world where language is engineered to narrow reality, to block any subversive thought, to keep citizens in a permanent state of confusion, fear, and obedience. But 1984 isn't just a novel of ideas. It's also a very human tragedy. Winston is not a classic hero. He's fragile, hesitant, conflicted. His rebellion starts in a small, almost childish way, writing in a secret diary, wanting to feel something real, loving someone honestly. And that's exactly what the party can't accept. Love, intimacy, private thought, all of that is a threat. Anything that escapes control is subversive. When Winston and Julia are arrested, the book takes us into the hell of the Ministry of Love, a bitter joke of a name. There, the last defenses of the self are broken. The torture isn't about getting information, it's about reshaping the soul. The party is not satisfied with victory. It wants devotion. It wants its enemies to truly accept it. The final stage of total control is reached when the oppressed sincerely loves the oppressor. The closing scene, when Winston realizes he loved Big Brother, is the most devastating moment in the book. Not just because it shows the party's victory, but because it reveals the final collapse of inner freedom. Orwell is saying, if power can control language, memory, pain, and love, then it controls everything. The defeat is not only political, it's existential. That's why 1984 is a philosophical work. It doesn't just give us a dystopian setting, it offers a theory of modern power, a kind of power that doesn't need constant open violence to win. It just needs to control words, erase the past, watch people without being seen, and slip into their most private thoughts. It's the birth of psychological totalitarianism, and Orwell builds it using real historical experiences, rearranged with the precision of someone painfully clear-eyed. The autobiographical side is key to understanding the force of the book. Orwell wasn't imagining a world that could never exist. He was describing a world that had already begun to appear in propaganda offices, secret courts, newspapers twisting headlines, and ideologies that rewrote their own failures. Sick, isolated, and close to death, Orwell finished 1984 as a work of moral urgency. Published in 1949, just months before he died, the book is a testament, a warning, a meditation on where humanity might end up if we keep accepting that truth is flexible and freedom is negotiable. Those years between 1946 and 1949 were not just a period of literary creation. They were a time of intense philosophical concentration. Orwell gathered everything he had lived, everything he had thought, everything he feared, and turned it into words that captured what very few people could see clearly at the time. A world where oppression doesn't always have a face, but is present everywhere, including inside us. In 1984, George Orwell creates one of the most unsettling and lasting ideas in modern political thought: doublethink. It's the ability, and more than that, the requirement, to hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time and accept both as true. It's not just a logical contradiction, it's a deep violation of reason, language, and, as a result, of freedom of thought. Doublethink is, at its core, what happens when the mind has been so colonized by power that logic is no longer a standard for truth. It becomes a threat. For the party, thinking in a coherent way is dangerous. Clear reasoning is risky. Ambiguity, confusion, and contradiction become strategic tools of control, not bugs in the system. The party's famous slogan in 1984 sums up this distortion. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. At first, these phrases are obviously absurd, but Orwell isn't describing a mistake. He's describing a project. Doublethink isn't a glitch in language. It's a redesign of language to serve domination. That's the philosophical key that makes 1984 so disturbing. The book doesn't just describe a regime that censors what people say. It rewires how people think. Historically, logic has been a tool of resistance. From Socrates to Kant, rational thought has been treated as a path to freedom. Asking questions, comparing ideas, drawing conclusions, challenging arguments. The internal consistency of what someone says used to be a basic test of truth. But Orwell realizes that in totalitarian systems, this logic is slowly replaced by performative statements that don't need to make sense. They just need to be obeyed. Doublethink is exactly that. The demand that people accept the absurd without hesitation. Winston, the main character in 1984, lives this inner torture. He knows the party lies. He knows the numbers are fake, the slogans don't add up. But at the same time, he's trained and forced to believe those lies, as if his own survival depends on destroying his capacity for logical thought. And in a way, it does. In the world of 1984, thinking logically is an act of treason. Doubting the party is a crime. Logic is subversive because it lets you compare what's said with what actually happens. That's exactly what the party can't allow. So, doublethink becomes not just a mental habit, but a survival strategy. Accepting the absurd is safer than resisting the madness. The idea that language can trap thought isn't new. Philosophers like Wittgenstein, Foucault, and Derrida, all in their own ways, talked about the limits of language and how it shapes thinking. But Orwell anticipates, with incredible clarity in literary form, the deliberate use of language as a tool of ideological control. In the world of 1984, Newspeak is the official language, a language designed not to expand communication, but to shrink what can even be thought. The vocabulary is cut down, synonyms are eliminated, meanings are flattened. Dangerous words like freedom, justice, and rebellion are removed or emptied out. Orwell shows that the most effective kind of oppression isn't the one that bans words outright. It's the one that makes those words meaningless. Doublethink is the soul of Newspeak. It demands that people use words without connecting them to reality, that they repeat lines like, "The party is infallible," even when the party is constantly rewriting its own story, that they accept that something has always been this way, even though they remember times when it wasn't. This mental dissonance is on purpose. It's not meant to convince people rationally. It's meant to break their inner resistance. In practice, Orwell is calling out the destruction of critical thinking. Critique is born from comparison, analysis, and doubt. Doublethink dissolves all of that. The individual isn't just forbidden to criticize. They lose the ability to criticize. Logic has been removed from the system. Language no longer helps people tell truth from lies or coherence from contradiction. The effect is devastating. The person no longer thinks to understand. They think to adapt. Their reason is bent out of shape. And with that, their identity starts to collapse too. They no longer know what they saw, what they felt, or what they believed. Memory gets edited. Doubt becomes guilt. Silence turns into self-defense. Orwell understands that the deepest kind of totalitarianism isn't the one that just controls newspapers. It's the one that controls neurons. When thought itself is domesticated, the regime doesn't even need that many police officers in the streets. People start policing themselves. Doublethink isn't just an idea. It's a method of cognitive submission. One of the most important points in Orwell's philosophy is his implicit criticism of dangerous forms of relativism. Even though he doesn't use that word directly, his worry about destroying objective truth and stretching language to mean anything anticipates many of today's problems. Relativism, when taken to the extreme, can open the door to doublethink. When every truth is just a narrative and every fact is treated as just one interpretation, the shared ground underneath us disappears. Without denying that the world is complex, Orwell insists that some things are objective. 2 + 2 is 4. History has records. Language has structure. And when these foundations are eaten away in the name of a freedom of interpretation with no limits, what's left is the tyranny of whatever is most convenient ideologically. This warning is especially relevant today, in a world of fake news, denialism, vague speeches, and information wars. Doublethink becomes a common practice, not always imposed by a regime, but sometimes adopted voluntarily by groups that prefer comforting beliefs over uncomfortable reality. The end result of doublethink is the collapse of consciousness. The person no longer knows what they think, because they no longer know what they feel, because they no longer have tools to tell what's real and what isn't. The inner self is hollowed out. Language no longer expresses, it hides. Winston, in 1984, lives this in his own skin. His attempt to resist begins with words. He writes in a diary. He tries to name what he feels. He tries to think clearly. But the party moves faster. It redefines terms, rewrites the past, and fills the world with surveillance. In the end, it wins not because it's right, but because it has destroyed the conditions needed for anyone to be right. In the face of all this, Orwell offers a path: reclaim language as a tool for clarity. In essays like Politics and the English Language, he insists that writing should be direct, simple, and precise. For him, clarity is an act of resistance. Every time we choose words carefully, look for the exact term, avoid empty jargon, we are, in a small way, pushing back against doublethink. That's a crucial philosophical lesson. Language shapes us, and because of that, it needs to be protected. When we speak truthfully, we think freely. When we just repeat without understanding, we open the door to authoritarianism, often without noticing. Orwell doesn't scream in 1984. He just describes, but what he describes is terrifying because it's possible. Doublethink isn't some distant nightmare. It starts with small compromises, convenient silences, and speeches that say nothing. Little by little, it turns language into a prison and thought into obedience. In the oppressive world of 1984, Big Brother isn't just a dictator. He's a symbol, a gaze, a constant presence that doesn't even need to be real to work. With this invisible character, George Orwell creates one of the most powerful metaphors ever written about modern power. Surveillance is a technology that not only watches, but shapes, and in the end, traps a person's mind. The famous line that opens the novel already sets the tone of the society Orwell describes. Big Brother is watching you. That isn't a direct threat. It's a constant reminder, a subtle warning that the eye of power never sleeps. And the scariest part is that no one knows if Big Brother actually exists. He might be a real leader or just an invented face, an icon built to hold up a system of total control. But his presence, or better, the idea of his presence, is enough for everyone to act as if they're always being watched. That's the core of the psychological control Orwell exposes. Public punishment is no longer necessary. It's enough to convince people they're being watched, and they'll punish themselves. The fear of the gaze is more effective than force. This logic anticipates, with impressive accuracy, the idea of panopticism that Michel Foucault would develop decades later in Discipline and Punish, 1975. Foucault revisits the model of the panopticon, created by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. A circular prison where a single guard in a central tower can see all the inmates, while they can't see him. As a result, each prisoner starts behaving as if he's always being watched, even when no one is looking. Orwell, without using this term, brilliantly anticipates the same idea. In the world of 1984, telescreens, devices that both broadcast and capture sound and image, are everywhere, in homes, hallways, workplaces. They might be off, but no one is sure. So every citizen starts watching themselves, not out of virtue, but out of fear. This internalized surveillance is a silent revolution. Power no longer needs to act from the outside. It seeps into the mind, shapes behavior, defines what can be said, thought, or felt. And once a person starts censoring themselves before they even act, power has already won, without lifting a finger. Philosophically, this is a major shift. The totalitarianism Orwell describes isn't enforced mainly by visible violence, but by an invisible invasion of the inner life. Control no longer stops at the body. It reaches into thought, language, and memory. Repression is replaced by self-repression. Obedience no longer has to be demanded. It becomes habit. Foucault would call this biopower, power that doesn't just kill, but manages life, that doesn't just forbid, but directs, that doesn't only crush people, but produces obedient subjects through normalization. In 1984, this normalization shows up in many ways. Citizens learn to smile when they're being watched, to keep neutral expressions, to avoid any gesture that might look like a thought crime. That word, by the way, is one of the most disturbing in the book. It's no longer about punishing actions. It's about punishing intentions, desires, doubts. And how do you know if someone committed a thought crime? You don't need to. The simple fact of doubting the party's orthodoxy is already a crime. And to detect those deviations, it's enough to watch behaviors, little tics, silences. The citizen becomes suspicious even of themselves. Orwell understands, in a deeply philosophical way, that surveillance works best when it's internalized. The state doesn't have to be physically present everywhere. It just has to convince you that it is. And that alone is enough to kill freedom. Not with a bullet, but with the fear of a thought. Big Brother is the symbolic face of this logic. He isn't just the supreme leader. He's like an inverted mirror of the self. A mirror that doesn't reflect who you really are, but who the party demands you appear to be. And the more you look into that mirror, the more you shape yourself to fit the image it wants. Winston is the portrait of a human being fighting against that mirror. He tries to keep an inner space alive, a secret diary, a private thought, a feeling that's still his. But surveillance is everywhere, and when he finally thinks he's safe, in a rented room, with no telescreen in sight, that's exactly where he's betrayed. Because in the world of 1984, there is no space outside the gaze. Intimacy is gone. The self has been colonized. This is the sharpest point in Orwell's critique. Surveillance doesn't just destroy outer freedom. It erases the authentic self, dissolves individuality, hollows out the subject. Instead of a thinking citizen, what's left is a compliant functionary, someone who repeats words without understanding them, smiles automatically, and watches themselves even when they're alone. Orwell shows, with painful clarity, that technology is far from neutral. It can easily be turned into a weapon of psychological control. Telescreens, microphones, sensors, all of this anticipates what we now call digital surveillance. Back in 1949, Orwell already sensed that the future of oppression wouldn't just be tanks and guns, but cameras, data, and tracking systems. In his critique, he's not just describing a fictional regime, he's asking a fundamental question. What happens to a human being when the possibility of being alone, thinking for themselves, and making mistakes in private disappears? The answer is unsettling. The person is emptied out. They stop being a subject and become a function, a profile, a piece of a system. Identity is replaced by performance. Thought is replaced by compliance. Ethics is replaced by protocol. And surveillance doesn't only destroy individuals, it also destroys trust in society. In 1984, citizens are encouraged to inform on each other. Children report their parents. Friends watch friends. Society falls apart. There are no real bonds left, only suspicion. Social connection is replaced by a web of mutual control, where every glance might be a threat. In this world, Big Brother wins, not because he's literally everywhere, but because he's felt everywhere. His presence is sensed, feared, anticipated, and that's enough to make everyone obey. The darkest part of Orwell's dystopia is that terror doesn't even need to act constantly. The fear has already been installed. By anticipating the logic of the panopticon, Orwell also gives us a clue for resistance, becoming aware of the gaze, knowing we're being watched, and refusing to accept that as normal, fighting for spaces of privacy, of free thought, of unmonitored silence, relearning how to think outside of someone else's eye. Because, as he shows, once even our thoughts are being watched, freedom isn't just at risk, it's already a crime. And in that world, resistance begins with thinking, and with protecting the right to think without being seen. The state rewrites the past to dominate the present, control of the narrative as a form of total power. Among the most disturbing creations in George Orwell's 1984, none is as symbolically devastating as the Ministry of Truth, the institution responsible for faking statistics, erasing people from history, altering official records, and, above all, making sure the past is always in perfect harmony with the needs of the present. In the structure of the totalitarian state Orwell imagines, the Ministry of Truth is living irony. Its name already says the opposite of what it actually does. Instead of preserving truth, it systematically destroys it, every single day, with bureaucratic efficiency and political precision. And that's no accident. Orwell knew that control over the past is the real foundation of total control over the present, and, as a result, over the future. The core of this logic appears in a kind of mantra in the novel. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. That line is the heart of Orwell's philosophical critique. The idea that modern power doesn't just need to rule bodies and territory. It needs to rule narratives. And to do that, it needs something deeper than censorship. It needs to rebuild memory, rewrite facts, and manufacture a convenient past. In the world of 1984, Winston Smith works at the Ministry of Truth. His job is to go through old records, newspapers, speeches, reports, and correct them. When the party changes its international alliances, Winston has to erase every mention of the previous enemy and replace it with references to the new one. When one of the party's predictions doesn't come true, he rewrites the documents so it looks like they were right all along. When someone disappears, for treason, suspicion, or simple convenience, he erases all proof that this person ever existed. It's as if the whole world is constantly being redrawn in silence. This non-stop work of falsification is what Orwell calls a mutable reality. And in describing it, he isn't just criticizing specific totalitarian regimes. He's showing how modern power, when it isn't challenged, feels entitled to edit reality the way an editor rewrites a book, deleting, reorganizing, omitting, rebuilding. Manipulating history is nothing new. Since ancient times, rulers have tried to control the legacy they leave behind. Emperors ordered their victories carved in stone while their failures were quietly ignored. But Orwell notices something new in the 20th century, a different kind of war. A war against memory. A systematic, technological, institutional war that turns history into an ideological battlefield where what matters isn't what happened, but what will be said to have happened. This kind of control is more effective than any physical violence because it doesn't just suppress facts. It changes how people think. If the past can be rewritten, then any mistake can be justified. Any shift in direction can be legitimized. Any atrocity can be forgotten. People lose stable reference points. Collective memory becomes disconnected from reality. And once no one really remembers what happened, no one can judge the present anymore. From a philosophical point of view, Orwell anticipates debates that would only become central decades later. Michel Foucault, for example, argues that power is inseparable from knowledge, and that whoever defines what counts as truth in a society exercises a subtle kind of control, the power to shape how reality is perceived. The Ministry of Truth is exactly that, a machine of epistemic control that doesn't rule with tanks or open censorship, but with archives, wording, and official versions. The war against memory is, therefore, a war against the autonomy of thought. Without a reliable history, a person loses the ability to compare, reflect, and critique. They end up living in an eternal amnesiac present, where everything is fluid, and the only fixed point is the official narrative. In that setting, the party becomes infallible, not because it never makes mistakes, but because it erases every trace of them. Winston, in his inner struggle, tries to hold on to the truth. He keeps fragmented memories of his childhood, tries to recall old songs, random facts that no longer fit with the official story. But he's surrounded by a world that constantly tries to convince him that his memories are acts of treason, his doubts are crimes, and his recollections are delusion. The state doesn't need to prove him wrong. It just needs to isolate him inside his own mind. This is one of Orwell's deepest philosophical contributions. The idea that memory is political terrain. Keeping real events alive, pains, betrayals, victories, is an act of resistance. That's why authoritarian regimes go after not only living opponents, but also uncomfortable memories. Monuments are taken down, books are banned, dates are renamed, historical figures are rewritten. History becomes something soft and moldable in the hands of power. Orwell shows that falsifying the past is much more than manipulating documents. It's manipulating identity. Who we are is tied to what we remember, and when they take away your memory, they also take away your ability to act freely. That's why 1984 still hits so hard in a world full of historical revisionism, denialism, and convenient rewrites of public narratives. When governments and institutions try to erase past crimes or soften periods of political violence, they're basically doing the work of a real-world ministry of truth, re-editing the past to dominate the present. The line, "Who controls the past controls the future," is more than a fictional slogan. It's a philosophical warning. Without memory, there is no critique. Without critique, there is no freedom. Orwell also understands that this manipulation doesn't always have to be brutal or obvious. Often, it happens in subtle ways, through omission, distraction, or an overload of irrelevant information that drowns out what really matters. Historical memory doesn't only collapse through erasure, but also through noise. In an ocean of random data, what's truly important disappears. He pushes us to ask, how do we resist this kind of control? How do we protect memory in the middle of a war of narratives? In 1984, the answer is bitter. Winston fails. Individual memory isn't enough against a full-scale machine of organized forgetting. But outside of fiction, Orwell seems to bet on something: writing, documenting, and watching language and power with a critical eye. Every time a fact is recorded accurately, every time history is told honestly, the Ministry of Truth loses a bit of its strength. The act of remembering, telling, and documenting becomes a political act, an ethical gesture, a form of resistance. In Orwell's world, the past isn't just what happened. It's what survives silence. And making sure it survives is the responsibility of everyone who refuses to live under institutionalized lies. At the heart of 1984, George Orwell's dystopian masterpiece, there's a quiet act of rebellion that, for a brief moment, feels more powerful than any weapon: love. Winston and Julia fall in love in secret, far from the telescreens, meeting in hidden places and promising each other moments of intimacy. In a world where even your thoughts are watched, loving someone is an act of subversion, maybe the most radical of all. But Orwell, in his brutal honesty, doesn't romanticize this resistance. He shows that under absolute totalitarianism, even love can be destroyed, not with laws, not with censorship, but with something no state should ever control: the mind, the emotions, the very sense of self. In this part of his philosophical critique of power, Orwell looks at the most intimate dimension of politics, the self. And he shows that totalitarianism, in its most twisted form, isn't satisfied with controlling behavior. It wants to invade the soul. It wants to rewrite feeling. It wants even love. That last inner space of freedom, to bow down to fear and loyalty to the state. The relationship between Winston and Julia begins as desire, but quickly becomes something deeper. A promise that there is still something real in a world built on lies. They meet in abandoned places, share confessions, and touch each other as if they were touching the possibility of existing outside the party. In a world where sex is merely functional, their passion is heresy. Orwell understands that totalitarianism can't tolerate bonds between individuals, because every bond of affection is a bond that escapes control. To love someone is to choose a center of loyalty that is not the state. It's to look at another person and see a whole universe, not just a role. It's to build a world between two people, something no machine of domination can allow. That's why Winston and Julia aren't just lovers, they are potential traitors. Because by choosing each other, they reject the party's total claim over their lives. They're basically saying, there is something in me you can't control. There's a feeling that escapes your gaze. But once again, Orwell doesn't offer easy redemption. He takes this love all the way to the edge and shows how, under torture, even what is most intimate can be broken. When Winston is captured and taken to the Ministry of Love, again, a dark and twisted name, one of the harshest and most philosophical sequences in all of 20th century literature begins. It's not about getting information. The goal of the torture isn't to extract truths, it's to produce obedience, and worse, to produce emotional loyalty. O'Brien, the party official in charge of re-educating Winston, makes this very clear. He says, "We don't just want you to obey, we want you to love Big Brother." Here Orwell dives into a deeply existential question. Can the self be destroyed? Is it possible to wipe out not just the body, but memory, belief, and love itself? The answer the book gives is terrifying. Yes. If the state is violent, systematic, and invasive enough, it can do more than silence a person. It can reprogram them. The human being, in this context, becomes malleable all the way down to the core. The most emblematic scene of this collapse of the self happens in Room 101. Winston is confronted with his greatest fear, rats. Panicking, he screams, desperate, "Do it to her! Do it to Julia! Not me!" In that darkest moment, love is betrayed, and not out of simple weakness, but because the terror is designed exactly for that, to break the last bond of loyalty to another person. The party isn't satisfied with winning. It wants to make the victim want the betrayal. Later, when Winston and Julia meet again, the coldness between them is the final proof that totalitarianism has won. There's no anger, no passion, just emptiness, a heavy silence. They admit to each other, "I betrayed you. I betrayed you too." And that's it. What once was a flame is now ash. Love has been rewritten. Their emotional memory has been wiped. The party didn't just destroy the relationship, it rewired their desire. From a philosophical point of view, Orwell is showing that absolute totalitarianism is the kind that turns intimacy into an extension of politics. There's no such thing as private anymore. Even your feelings have to be loyal to the state. Love, which once served as a shield against despair, becomes just another field of domination. This view echoes Hannah Arendt's philosophy, especially in The Origins of Totalitarianism. For Arendt, totalitarian regimes don't just repress, they destroy human spontaneity, which is the basis of ethical action. Love, friendship, promises, everything that depends on inner freedom, is treated as a threat. Michel Foucault also comes close to this idea when he talks about power-producing subjectivities. The totalitarianism of 1984 doesn't just forbid, it shapes people who no longer even want to disobey. And that's the most tragic part. The individual internalizes the oppressor's gaze so deeply that they start policing their own feelings, even how they love. Winston and Julia's story pushes us to ask, what is the self when it can no longer hold on to anyone? What's left of identity when all bonds are dissolved? When even desire is treated as a crime? When affection has to be confessed? When caring about someone becomes illegal? What's left that is still human? Orwell's answer is bleak. Very little. At the end of the novel, Winston is sitting in a cafe, drinking. He no longer rebels. He no longer loves Julia. He thinks, but it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. That's the total collapse of the self. Love has been redirected. Pain has been recycled. The I has been erased. In its place, there's a compliant mask that feels what the party demands, thinks what the party dictates, and loves what it once hated. The lesson Orwell gives us here isn't just political, it's deeply ethical and existential. He warns us that the real horror of totalitarianism doesn't lie only in outside prohibitions, but in inner destruction, in the impossibility of trusting, desiring, remembering, loving. In a world like that, resistance doesn't start with weapons. It starts with recognizing the other, with insisting on loving even when love is forbidden, with keeping alive the memory that something once existed outside of control, something pure, intimate, real. Winston tried. Julia tried. But Orwell wanted to show that if power isn't confronted at its roots, language, memory, emotion, it doesn't just dominate us, it remakes us. George Orwell died on January 21st, 1950, at the age of 46, consumed by tuberculosis. He died poor, exhausted, isolated, and fully aware that his time was running out. But he also died knowing he had left behind a body of work that would outlive him, a body of work that belongs not only to literature, but also to philosophy, ethics, and the ongoing fight against institutionalized lies. Orwell was not an academic theorist. He didn't write treatises or build complex philosophical systems, but he understood, better than almost anyone, the ethical dimension of language and the central role it plays in the structure of modern power. And maybe that's why his voice has carried so strongly through the decades, because he didn't write from the safety of a university office, but from the edge of the abyss, with a fragile body, a mind on fire, and a world on the verge of new forms of domination. When he finished writing 1984, Orwell was already very sick. Isolated on the Scottish island of Jura, surrounded by sea, fog, and icy winds, he wrote with a fever, struggling to breathe, going through crises that threatened his life week after week, and yet he kept writing. Why? Because, as he said in his letters, he felt the world was heading in a dangerous direction, and that it was urgent to leave a warning. His last book is not just a dystopia, it's an alarm. It's a desperate, but lucid, attempt to interrupt the moral numbness and manipulation of thought that he saw taking root in both democracies and dictatorships after the war. And at the center of this critique is, without a doubt, language. Orwell understood something that is widely studied today, but in his time was often underestimated. Whoever controls language controls thought. You don't need to ban ideas if you can hollow out the words that express them. You don't need to openly repress opinions if you can twist meanings until everyone talks a lot, without actually saying anything. For Orwell, that was the core of institutionalized lying. A system that reshapes language in order to blur reality, cover up abuses, and make criticism impossible. Newspeak in 1984 is not just a literary device, it's the extreme formalization of a trend Orwell had already noticed as a journalist and essayist. In pieces like Politics and the English Language, he called out the growing use of vague expressions, technical jargon, bureaucratic euphemisms, and ready-made phrases that cut language off from lived reality. Phrases like structural adjustment, tactical actions, collateral damage, preventive protection, which still dominate political and media speech today, are perfect examples of what Orwell would call lies packaged as neutrality. Lies that don't scream, but whisper, that slip into everyday speech. That put our critical sense to sleep because they dress up violence in polite words. Orwell's critique of language is therefore ethical. For him, using language with precision, clarity, and honesty is not just a matter of style. It's a matter of moral responsibility. Writing well isn't about picking fancy words. It's about committing to the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. That ethical view of language runs through his entire life's work. From his reports on the poor and homeless in Down and Out in Paris and London, to his critique of colonialism in Shooting an Elephant, Orwell writes like someone carrying the weight of reality on his back. He refuses to lie, even when lying would be easier, ideologically, politically, or personally. And it was that commitment that led him to break with ideologies from all sides. Orwell was a socialist, but not a communist. He fought alongside the left in the Spanish Civil War, but exposed the crimes committed by that same left. He criticized British imperialism, but also the abuses of the USSR. He refused to wear the jersey of any orthodoxy. And because of that, he was attacked from every direction. But he never backed down, because he believed that truth, even fragile truth, is the only force capable of resisting the power of organized lies. That conviction is crystallized in 1984, written with the last breaths of his life as a kind of philosophical testament. In that book, Orwell shows us a world where lies are not just allowed, they're official policy. The Ministry of Truth rewrites the past. The Ministry of Love tortures in the name of purity. Big Brother is everywhere, even if he might not exist at all. And Newspeak works day after day to shrink people's ability to think freely. This vision, extreme as it is not a hallucination. Orwell builds it from what he observed in the real world, in the fascist and communist regimes of his time, but also in liberal democracies that, in his view, were starting to adopt the same rhetorical vices, hiding interests, massaging numbers, and manufacturing consensus through language. His critique is timeless because it's not limited to one regime or ideology. It points to a condition of modern power, the constant temptation to use language not to illuminate reality, but to control it, not to reveal, but to hide, not to foster dialogue, but to manipulate. Orwell died, but that critique lived on. And not only lived on, it became more and more urgent. Today, we live in a world where lying has become more sophisticated, where language manipulation is supercharged by technology, where speeches are shaped by algorithms, driven by economic and political interests, and repeated by millions of voices that echo, without thinking, the key terms of whatever ideology happens to be dominant. We live in an age of disinformation, empty polarization, and narratives that often matter more than facts. And in this context, Orwell's voice rings out like a warning light. Language is the battlefield of freedom. The immortality of his critique lies exactly there, in reminding us that as long as there are people willing to twist words, there must also be people willing to restore their meaning. As long as there is official speech that erases real suffering, there must be honest writing that brings it back. As long as language is used as a mask, there must be language used as exposure. Orwell didn't live to see the impact of his work. He didn't know that 1984 would become one of the most influential books of the 20th century, or that the word Orwellian would be used to describe governments, systems, and technologies he never lived to see. But he did know, as he was writing, that he was fighting against forgetfulness, against conformism, against the hollowing out of words. And that's why his work is immortal, because it doesn't depend on a specific context. It speaks to something fundamental, the integrity of thought. And that integrity begins and ends with language. If George Orwell, with 1984, launched one of the most powerful attacks on 20th century totalitarian power, Michel Foucault, a few decades later, did something just as revolutionary. But in another direction, he showed that modern power is not only concentrated in brutal dictatorships and open censorship, but also spreads out, seeps in, and operates invisibly in our bodies, language, and everyday behavior. Both thinkers talk about control, but they talk about different forms of control. And maybe that's why, more than being opposites, they actually complement each other. Together, they give us two essential lenses to understand how power works in contemporary society. Orwell warns us about the terror of explicit authoritarianism. Foucault reveals the danger of silent discipline. Orwell writes in the heat of the 20th century, between world wars, rising totalitarian regimes, state propaganda, and armed repression. His critique comes from direct experience with systems that controlled people through brute force, constant surveillance, censorship of ideas, and manipulation of historical truth. For Orwell, power is centralized, visible, and vertical. It has a face, Big Brother, a headquarters, the Ministry of Truth, and a clear goal: to eliminate any possibility of independent thought. Foucault, on the other hand, writes in the 1960s and 1970s, in a different context. There are no concentration camps in plain sight anymore, no towering figures like Stalin or Hitler. The Western world looks free. But that's exactly when he raises the question: are we really free, or did power just change its shape? For Foucault, the danger is no longer the tyrant, but the norm. It's no longer the authoritarian leader, but the institutions of everyday life: school, medicine, psychiatry, the prison system, statistics, scientific discourse. Modern power, in his view, doesn't mainly forbid, it regulates. It doesn't just impose by force, it shapes us through routines. It doesn't say, you can't think. It makes sure certain thoughts never even appear. While Orwell builds an explicit dystopia with surveillance cameras, physical torture, and rewritten history, Foucault points to an invisible dystopia that settles in quietly. He shows how, in modern societies, people watch each other, and even themselves, without needing an external oppressor standing over them. That's where a crucial meeting point appears between the two: the theme of surveillance. In 1984, Orwell creates Big Brother, a symbolic figure representing the total presence of the state through telescreens, microphones, party agents, and absolute control over the past. Orwell shows that the individual loses autonomy because they feel watched all the time. Foucault takes this idea to another level with the concept of panopticism, inspired by Jeremy Bentham's design for the ideal prison, a circular building with a tower in the center, where a single guard can see every prisoner, while the prisoners can't see the guard. The result? Each prisoner behaves as if they're being watched, even if no one is actually watching. That internalized surveillance becomes the operating model for schools, hospitals, factories, offices, and even social networks. For Foucault, the panopticon is not just a prison, it's a social blueprint. And, just like Big Brother, it doesn't need to be physically present at all times. The possibility of being watched is enough to shape behavior. But here, there's a key difference between the two thinkers. In Orwell, control comes from the top down. The party imposes, decides, manipulates. Power is hierarchical and clearly authoritarian. Foucault breaks with that image. For him, power is not something you own. It's something you exercise. It's not concentrated in one person or institution, but circulates. It's in discourses, practices, forms of knowledge, and social relationships. In other words, modern power doesn't need a big brother. It works even without a center, because we've been educated, trained, and conditioned to follow norms, to fit in, to judge ourselves using outside standards. We are products of systems that operate naturally without looking coercive. The strength of Foucault's critique lies exactly there, in revealing power where we least expect it. In the medical norm that defines what's healthy, in the school that separates good and bad students, in the therapist who decides what is normal behavior, in the political speech that turns poverty into a matter of lack of effort. In all those places, power is at work, operating on bodies, desires, and truths. If Orwell shows us a world where the state dominates through force, Foucault shows us a world where society itself becomes an instrument of domination. And that shift is crucial for understanding the present. Today, we don't live under a regime like the one in 1984. There's no single party, no compulsory telescreen on the wall. But we do live under constant surveillance, watched by cameras, algorithms, tracking systems, and social media that analyze our habits, preferences, and emotions. And beyond that, we live under social expectations and norms that shape how we're supposed to act, speak, desire, and exist. At this point, Orwell and Foucault line up in a disturbing way. The final result of control, whether explicit or diffuse, is the same, shaping the subject. Orwell shows the individual who gives in to terror, who ends up loving Big Brother because he can no longer love anything outside obedience. Foucault shows the individual who gives in to the norm, who adapts, compares themselves, corrects themselves, without ever realizing they're trapped. But if their diagnoses are different, their conclusions come together around one central ethical question. How do we resist? How do we regain autonomy? How do we think critically inside systems that shape even the way we think? Orwell suggests that resistance starts with honest language, with refusing to accept the vocabulary of lies, with defending factual truth. It's an ethics of the word, writing, naming, remembering. Foucault, in turn, puts his bet on a genealogy of knowledge, analyzing discourses, tracing where our truths come from, deconstructing the systems we treat as natural. It's an ethics of digging, questioning, uncovering, making the invisible visible. Both, then, call us to critical vigilance, not just against some external enemy, but against the internal mechanisms that make us obey, repeat, and accept without thinking. Today, faced with constant digital exposure, mass information, and a fragmented public debate, Orwell's work and Foucault's philosophy are more necessary than ever. They show us that power has changed its mask, but not its ambition, and that if freedom still matters to us, it has to be defended not only in the streets, but also inside language, inside algorithms, and inside our own subjectivity. How his work is still central to debates about digital surveillance, fake news, authoritarianism, and the importance of free speech. More than 70 years after his death, George Orwell is still here, not just as an author, but as a kind of critical conscience of our time. His name became an adjective, his work turned into a warning, and his ideas still echo because he saw clearly what many preferred to ignore. That modern power doesn't just want to control bodies, it wants to shape how we think. And that freedom, if it isn't protected every single day, doesn't disappear with a bang. It just quietly fades away. In the 21st century, we live under a promise of unprecedented freedom. With the internet, we have access to almost all of human knowledge. We can express ourselves, create content, expose abuses, and organize in networks. It's never been so easy to publish an idea, and at the same time, it's never been so hard to know if that idea is actually true. We live in a kind of Orwellian paradox. We have too much information, but not enough understanding. We have a voice, but we're surrounded by noise. We have freedom of speech, but we're increasingly trapped by manufactured narratives, algorithm-shaped conversations, and manipulation networks that use our freedom itself to spread lies. It's in this context that Orwell's philosophical legacy feels more relevant than ever. Not as a literal prediction, but as an ethical key to understand how power hides inside systems that look like freedom. Orwell always defended freedom, but not as a vague slogan. For him, freedom meant the ability to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. In 1984, maybe the most powerful line is, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4. That sounds basic, almost childish. But in times of ideological manipulation, denialism, and historical revisionism, saying the obvious has become a political act. The kind of freedom Orwell defends isn't about markets, advertising, or self-promotion on social media. It's the inner freedom to think clearly, to name what you see, and to refuse to bow down to a lie. And that's even more urgent today. The biggest threats to freedom aren't just openly authoritarian regimes. They're systems that push us toward conformity from the inside, without us noticing. They're the invisible filters of algorithms, echo chambers, and populist speeches that offer easy truths in exchange for our critical thinking. Orwell taught us that freedom requires active vigilance. It's not enough for it to be written into law. We have to practice it. And that means responsibility, courage, and a constant duty to resist the seduction of comfortable lies. One of the most important pillars of Orwell's thought is his defense of truth as a non-negotiable political value. In a world where everything can be spun and where every group builds its own narrative, Orwell reminds us that without truth, there is no real debate, no justice, and no democracy. The explosion of fake news, systematic disinformation, and alternative narratives in the 21st century is exactly the scenario Orwell feared. A world where language loses contact with reality and facts are replaced by versions. In 1984, the Ministry of Truth rewrites the past so it never contradicts the present. Today, we see updated versions of this. Governments denying statistics, leaders lying in public without consequences, social networks boosting lies more efficiently than any newspaper ever could. Orwell didn't offer technical solutions, but he did offer an ethical direction. Telling the truth, even when it's inconvenient, is the first step of resistance. That applies to journalists, but also to everyday people. Truth isn't a dogma, but it also isn't a fiction. It's the result of a commitment to facts, to intellectual honesty, and to refusing to twist language just to gain power. Maybe the most prophetic part of Orwell's work is his focus on surveillance. In the world of 1984, people are watched by telescreens, microphones, and party agents. Today, there's no single big brother. There are many. Our phones, security cameras, voice assistants, GPS, and browsing history already generate more data than any totalitarian regime could have dreamed of controlling. But the difference is subtle and dangerous. Instead of being watched by force, we hand over our data willingly. We allow companies to track our habits in exchange for convenience. Slowly, we start treating surveillance as normal. After all, it's just an algorithm, right? But Orwell already warned us, even the smallest loyalty to someone else can be punished. The party wants your love. Today, the party has other names: platforms, big data, the cloud, predictive AI. And the goal isn't just to know what we do, but to predict what we're going to do. Control has become statistical, predictive, and invisible. And that makes it much harder to fight. Orwell gives us a critical framework to resist. Question the constant gaze, demand spaces of privacy, defend the right to be imperfect and offline, away from the system's eyes. Throughout his life, Orwell rejected every kind of fanaticism. He distrusted ideologies that promise paradise and end in censorship. That's why his philosophy of resistance isn't grand or heroic. It starts in the details, in the act of thinking for yourself, writing clearly, loving someone outside the logic of power, keeping memories alive that the state or the system would prefer to erase. The resistance Orwell proposes isn't flashy, it's persistent, and that's what makes it powerful. In an age of constant noise, emotional manipulation, and engagement without reflection, resisting means staying lucid. And lucidity starts when we name what we're living with precision. Orwell wasn't an optimist. He believed that totalitarianism is a permanent temptation because it offers order in the middle of chaos. But he also believed that human beings have the ability to say no, to keep, even in silence, a spark of free consciousness. That's the flame he left us, and it's up to us to keep it burning. Orwell in the 21st century, a guide for our language crisis. In a polarized world where words like freedom, truth, democracy, and censorship are thrown around loosely, or even used in contradictory ways, Orwell invites us to recover the meaning of words, to turn language back into a space of clarity, not manipulation. His work warns us that the collapse of language comes before the collapse of freedom, and that protecting language from lies is the same as protecting our minds from oppression. That's why 1984 and Animal Farm aren't just books about old regimes. They're maps for understanding the present. They're compasses to navigate the maze of speeches that try to divide us, numb us, and convince us that critical thinking is dangerous. George Orwell died in 1950, but his words are still watching the watchers. Not as a dogma, but as an invitation. Don't get comfortable. Don't just repeat. Don't stay silent. In the 21st century, maybe the most radical act is simply this: think clearly, speak truthfully, resist with lucidity. And if you made it this far, know this: that already is an act of resistance. In a rushed, distracted world, overflowing with voices that only shout, taking the time to slow down, reflect, think critically, and look for meaning is a powerful way to keep alive the kind of freedom Orwell defended so fiercely. If this content spoke to you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel keep bringing deep reflections like this. Comment down below, which lesson from Orwell's work hit you the hardest? The surveillance? The language? Love under totalitarianism? Let's build a space to exchange ideas, because resistance is also born from dialogue. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Maybe someone around you is still stuck in the fog of distraction, and you can be the link that wakes them up. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. We still have many thinkers, ideas, and stories to explore together, with depth, awareness, and courage. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. Stick around on the channel and choose another video to watch.